Hello, I'm John McBride, and thank you for joining me to talk about a Hokusai scroll which depicts a journey to the Yoshiwara Courtesan district of Old Edo, today's Tokyo. In this talk, I'll introduce resources, a map of our walk, examine the art history of the scroll, describe the Yoshiwara Courtesan district, and then we'll have some fun comparing the streetscape along our walk with Hokusai's scroll. And we'll finish with a visit to a working tea house in today's Tokyo. First, resources. I have provided a 25-page guide to the suggested day walk, and this is available at bit.ly/Hokusai walk. An excellent reference is Professor Timon Screech's Tokyo Before Tokyo, which is available on Kindle. Chapter 6 deals with a trip to the Yoshiwara using many other artworks. And a recommended book about the Courtesan district is The Japanese and Pleasure Quarters by Professor Tanaka Yuko. Unfortunately, it is only available in Japanese, but I have translated the first chapter for you in the Hokusai Walk document, and I'll discuss her thesis in a moment. Second, a map of our walk. Japan's capital, Tokyo, sits in the middle of the main island of Japan, Honshu, facing the Pacific Ocean. Until 1868, Tokyo was known as Edo. Hokkaido is in the north, and the two smaller islands of Shikoku and Kyushu are in the southwest. Tokyo sits on the Great Kanto Plain, the population of which is about 43 million. Today, Tokyo metropolis has a population of 14 million. At the time our Hokusai scroll was painted, Edo was the most populous city in the world, with a population well over 1 million. The center of Tokyo is the old Edo Castle, today's Imperial Palace. It's possible to visit the old castle keep's foundations in the east gardens of the palace. Many of you will arrive at the beautiful Tokyo station, and Hokusai's scroll will guide us up the Sumida River and then overland to the Yoshiwara Courtesan district. Our day walk begins at the Asakusa subway station, easily reached from anywhere in Tokyo on the Asakusa subway line. From the subway station, it's a short walk to Sensoji Temple, the oldest temple in Tokyo. The priests open the doors to the temples at 6:30 a.m., and I suggest a magical early morning start before the crowds arrive. Then on to the Matsuchiyama Shoden Temple, dedicated to Ganesha, and then across the Sanya Canal pedestrian park. This is a pleasant green strolling path today as the canal has been filled in. However, as my warning indicates, while Tokyo is one of the safest cities in the world, the area known as Senzoku, which surrounds the old Yoshiwara Courtesan district, is the most dangerous area in the city, and I do not suggest a visit there, certainly not on your own or at night. We then cross over the Sumida River on the pedestrian pathway called Cherry Blossom Bridge or Sakura Bashi to visit Mimeguri and Ushijima shrines, then through Sumida Park onto the Yasuda Garden, and then we finish at the Sumida Hokusai Museum. Next, the scroll itself. The scroll was painted by Katsushika Hokusai in 1805. It is hand-painted, unlike his most famous work, The Great Wave of Kanagawa, which is a woodblock print. The title is Scenery on Both Banks of the Sumida River. It was commissioned by Utei Emba, who also provides the humorous text at the end of the scroll. The painting is Hokusai's largest work, over 6 meters long or 21 feet and 28 centimeters or about 1 foot high. It starts at the top right at Yanagibashi Bridge, where of an evening hundreds of water taxis would wait to take customers up the Sumida River 2.9 kilometers or 2 miles to the entry to the Sanya Canal. Depicted in the middle section is the walk from there up to the Yoshiwara Courtesan district. And then at the bottom, the interior of a tea house is depicted. The scroll is finished with prose, which lists the place names passed on this journey in a humorous, onomatopoeic way. We start at the Yanagibashi Bridge ferry terminal. Hokusai uses shadow to create a calm scene along the Sumida River. Hokusai was studying Western art and use of shadow at this time, but its use in Japanese art was unusual. It would be another 50 years before Hiroshige takes Edo by storm with his use of shadow. We look at one of Hiroshige's prints shortly. I like to think that Hiroshige may have viewed this scroll by his great influence, Hokusai. Hokusai also uses patches of greenery, almost as cloud-like devices, to highlight famous locations along both banks of the river. Shadow is used again in the foliage to create depth in the clouds of greenery. We see here the use of a bird. Can you see the hototogisu? The cuckoo flying above the temple roof. This scene would be made famous again by Hiroshige 50 years later in his 100 Famous Views of Edo series. The next bridge is Okawa Bridge, or bridge over the main river, known today as Azuma Bridge, linking Sensoji Temple with Honjo. It was built at the request of the locals in 1774, about 30 years before Hokusai painted this scene. After its construction, Honjo on the far bank flourished. We see glimpses of Sensoji Temple's 5-storied pagoda. Note that this is on the eastern side of the temple, not as it's located today on the western side. Also, in the bottom left, we see the smaller roof of Kaminori Mon Gate, then Hozo Mon Gate, and then the main hall, which we'll visit shortly. The wonderful Mimeguri Shrine comes into view on the far bank, with many visitors docked near its famous Torii Gate, which is only half visible, the bottom half famously being obscured by the Sumida River embankment. We will visit here in a moment. And then the perspective of the painting changes as we dock at Imado-bashi Bridge ferry terminal in the bottom right. In the distance, with the clear skies of the Edo period, we can see Mount Tsukuba in the top left. We now travel overland along the embankment of the Sanya Canal, either in a palanquin or by foot, but always accompanied by a lit lantern held by a staff member of the Inviting Tea House, which is responsible for arranging all of your enjoyment for the evening and for collecting payment in the following morning. Customers would turn left down off the embankment at Mikairi Yanagi, the weeping willow, where one would gaze back at the Yoshiwara the following morning with intimate memories. And then down the dog-legged Emonzaka, or dressing hill, where we would adjust our clothing in anticipation of our arrival at the Yoshiwara. The dogleg was designed to disguise who was arriving. In the very far bottom left, we can see the Omon Gate of Yoshiwara itself. The treatment of Nakanocho, the main street of Yoshiwara, and the first of its side streets, Edocho, I think is very beautiful. It hints at the stratification of society within the Yoshiwara. First-class brothels were located along the Nakanocho, second-class on the side streets, and third-class brothels overlooked the ditches or moats, which kept the girls prisoners within the Yoshiwara. We finish with a glimpse of the Yagura fire tower in the bottom right. Yoshiwara geisha were called Yagura geisha, but this is not in reference to this tower, rather to the Yagura structures of the Saruwakacho theatre district nearby, which we'll visit shortly. We then enter a tea house, or may I call it for what it is, a brothel. In the first room, the inviting tea house has arranged a meal. Hokusai depicts a delicious-looking sea bream, which will be cooked later for the guests. Once the meal was finished, guests moved to a larger room for entertainment. Now, it's possible that the gentleman dressed in brown is a self-portrait by Hokusai. Hokusai was 46 when he painted the work, surrounding himself with doting geisha. We finish with an intimate scene when the customer is finally led to a small antechamber where there would be bedding. We know this is a top-class brothel because there are 3 layers of futon. Second-class brothels had 2, and third-class brothels had just 1 futon. Utei Emba then writes that he commissioned the work in 1805, and the work was produced at a salon gathering at his home. The term for an artwork produced at a salon gathering is sekiga. Emba writes, Utei Emba Oju, commissioned by Utei Emba, oite, at Danshuro, which is his home. Kyukyusai, which was Hokusai's artist's name just for the year of 1805, and then Hokusai Sekiga, or a Hokusai salon painting. Emba then writes in a comedic way the place names of the locations we have just passed, much as I am about to take you through the detail of them now. And it's dated at the end 1805, which is one reason given for its value. The provenance of the scroll is that it was commissioned by Utei Emba, who is famous for repopularizing the art of comedic storytelling in the late 18th century. This storytelling is called rakugo, and there are wonderful performances on YouTube of rakugo performed in English. So do have a look at them. The scroll was then purchased by a prolific collector of Hokusai's works, Honma Kozo, who then sold it to a Japanese art dealer working in Paris. Hayashi Tadamasa sold vast quantities of Japanese art into Europe and was important in the Japonisme, or Europe's love of affair with Japanese art movement in the 19th century. Hayashi then sold the scroll at auction in Paris in 1903, and we have the auction documents. But we lose track of the scroll then for about 100 years until it is placed for sale at Christie's in 2008, where it's offered for about 60,000 US dollars, but sells for over 1.1 million US dollars, which was a world record for the artist and for a pre-modern Japanese painting. 4 years later, it was purchased by the Sumida Hokusai Museum for $1.3 million US as the museum's centerpiece, and it's used to open the museum in November 2016. The museum was designed by Sejima Kazuyo, one of the 2 members of the famous Sana architecture firm, which also designed the new Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, the Louvre Lens Museum north of Paris, the 21st Century Contemporary Art Museum in Kanazawa, and the Sydney Modern Museum, which opened in December 2022. The museum is an open, inviting structure, sitting well in its contemporary setting with a children's playground in the front. Now, the museum is located at Hokusai's birthplace. He was born in 1760, and Hokusai would live in the Sumida ward for most of his 90 years. His masterpieces were created largely around the location of the museum. And there is a theory that his daughter, Oe, appearing in this life-size model in the museum, assisted him in his later years. This is the scroll at the opening of the museum. Now, let's consider the Yoshiwara courtesan district. Yoshiwara was the only licensed courtesan district in Edo. Fukagawa was the unlicensed district. The first great ruler of Edo reluctantly agreed to the existence of a brothel district serving the city. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the first shogun of Edo, and he stated that virtuous men have said, both in poetry and classic works, that houses of debauch for women of pleasure and for streetwalkers are the worm-eaten spots of cities and towns. But these are necessary evils, and if they are forcibly abolished, men of unrighteous principles will become like unraveled thread. Professor Tanaka states that yukaku must never again appear in this world, nor is it possible that the pleasure quarters and the huge economic systems that supported them can ever be reproduced. The reason for the first is the human rights abuses that were committed against the women. Some 3,000 to 5,000 women worked in the Yoshiwara at any one time. Their parents were provided a loan, which the girls had to work off. Most died before this was possible. Life expectancy was about 23 due to malnutrition and venereal disease. Because the parents received a loan, they were not seen as slaves, but of course they were. The second reason she gives, that is why yukaku cannot happen again economically, requires some back-of-the-envelope calculations. In the first year of the new democratic government of Meiji, 12% of the revenue of the newly named city of Tokyo came from prostitution. I calculate, therefore, that about $600 to $800 million a year was being spent in the Yoshiwara. Tanaka points out that while this vast sum would never be spent in a single courtesan district again, at the time it did support much of what we recognize today as Japanese culture. The traditional Japanese cuisine that we all love today, Japanese architecture, music, the tea ceremony, language, including poetry in both Japanese and Chinese verse, Japanese textiles, paper and fan making, and much, much more. All of these fine cultures that we appreciate today were incubated and protected in the Yoshiwara with those vast sums of money for over 300 years. The Yoshiwara also supported an entire art industry. So many of the artists that we love today focused on the beauties of the Yoshiwara district. Even the most famous landscape artist, Hiroshige, featured the main gate of the Yoshiwara at dawn in his famous series, 100 Famous Places of Edo. And he placed some of the courtesans in his painting. The reality was much less beautiful. The tea houses were impressive and powerful institutions. None of the money flowed directly to the courtesans. They were prisoners, and this world was not a place of beauty for them. Only the most senior of courtesans might eventually be able to pay their parents' debts when they were first sold into this world of abuse. The senior courtesans were called oiran, and you might consider viewing the Oiran parade in Asakusa in April, and this recreates one of the 4 famous festivals of the Yoshiwara district. The Oiran were always accompanied by 4 young girls in training to be geisha called shinzo, and the young children who were sold into this slavery were called kamuro.
だ一つの社交場でございます。最初に徳川家康公が承認した吉原は元吉原と呼ばれ、江戸城から遠くない場所にありましたが、明暦の大火の後に浅草の外れに移転して新吉原と呼ばれるようになりました。江戸時代で吉原といえばこの新吉原のことを指します。吉原の壮大な敷地は城郭のように周囲を塀で囲み、鳥さながらのお歯黒土が巡らされ、出入り口は大門と呼ばれる門ただ一つだけでした。吉原には大、中、小の店と呼ばれる社交場が合わせて200軒以上あり、男性客が遊興に通う一大歓楽地で繁華街でもあります。花魁は大店の議論に住み、身の回りの世話をする妹代わりの親族。
All right. So let's have some fun comparing the content of the scroll with the contemporary streetscape of Tokyo. We start at the impressive Ryogokubashi Bridge spanning the Sumida River. The bridge is thronging, and we can see lances held by the vanguards of feudal lords. The shape of the lance indicated who the lord was. 50 years later, Hiroshige described Ryogoku Bridge as the liveliest place in the eastern capital, with sideshows, theatres, storytellers, and summer fireworks. Day and night, the amusements never cease. This is the bridge today. On the far side of the bridge is Ekoin Temple, which stands today and is important because it commemorates the 100,000 souls lost in the Great Fire of Meireki in 1657. The fire caused the entire layout of the streets of Edo to be changed and is basically the layout of Tokyo we see today. The other two occasions when over 100,000 citizens of Tokyo perished in disasters was on 1 September 1923, when the city was hit by a great earthquake, and on 10 February 1945, when the city was incendiary bombed by the US military. Ekoin was also famous for sumo wrestling. After occasional hostings in the 1700s and early 1800s, all main tournaments took place at the Ekoin Temple between 1833 and 1909. Hiroshige depicts the stadium in two woodblock prints of the ring and a bird's eye view of the temple compound. And this is why the Sumo Center is still located just north of Ekoin today, and is a wonderful visit if you are in town during the time of a bout. The smaller bridge is the Yanagibashi Bridge, or Willow Tree Bridge. It spans a famous tributary to the Sumida called the Kanda River. The bridge was rebuilt immediately after the 1923 earthquake, and this is that bridge, and is a rare example of a recovery bridge designed after the Japanese studied bridges along the Rhine River. At the bridge, we see two types of boats, a covered one, which 4 gentlemen and a geisha are about to board, and a chokibune high-speed taxi. Now, the covered boats still dock at Yanagibashi Bridge, and it's here you can board a night cruise of Tokyo Bay and the Sumida River while enjoying a traditional meal. It's a very pleasant experience, and in the tradition of the covered boat depicted in our scroll. You can make reservations for dinner on the boats at amitatsu.jp and expect to pay about 11,000 yen for dinner and the cruise. The second boat depicted is a chokibune. Now, these were the high-speed taxis, which were the sophisticated way to travel along the Sumida River up to the Yoshiwara. Choki means boar tusk, a wild pig, boar tusk. Because of their sharp tapered bow. And a preservation group conducts tours every Wednesday in this type of boat. This is an image of a chokibune, or two chokibune, arriving upstream on the Sumida River at the Imadobashi Bridge, where we'll visit. It was common for just one or two customers to be rowed up the river on these high-speed taxis.
Oh.
'So in this famous folk song, chokibune are referred to in the first stanza, crossing the Sumida to the unlicensed Courtesan district of Fukagawa. And then the song continues in the second stanza that they've taken a chokibune up to the Sanya Canal, and you'd continue in a palanquin to the Yoshiwara. We finish with the advertising hoardings for a circus that is visiting from Osaka and involves horse riding and tricks. Now, moving along the scroll, we come to two bridges and the Matsumae residence. This is the Okurabashi Bridge with the corner of the Matsumae residence visible to the right. Now, you can see from this Edo period map that the two bridges spanned across canals to a large storage depot for construction materials owned by the shogunate or the military government. They stored building materials here, mainly stones, bamboo, and timber, or takegura means honorable bamboo warehouse. And the Matsumae residence is circled. The canals no longer exist, but the large area of shogunate land has been used to build the sumo stadium, which we saw earlier, the city's main museum, the Edo Tokyo Museum, and behind it, is our Sumida Hokusai Museum. This is the wonderful Edo Tokyo Museum, and I'm looking forward to its complete refurbishment and reopening in 2026. On the opposite side of the Okurabashi is the Matsudaira Estate and the Komadome Ishi Stone, or horse hitching stone. Now, in 1631, a typhoon caused flooding along the Sumida River. Damage was considerable at Honjo, and the third shogun, Iemitsu, the great building shogun, surveyed the damage, but no one could get across the river. Finally, a senior public servant, Abe Tadaaki, was able to ford Sumida River on horseback, and when resting his horse, he hitched the horse to this rock, and he was later worshipped as a deity by the grateful locals of Honjo. Now, the gardens, this stands in the gardens of the Matsudaira estate. They survive today and are known as the old Yasuda Gardens after they were purchased by the Yasuda trading conglomerate. Now, a feature of the central garden is that it was tidal, as were many of the estates along the Sumida. Today, the only tidal ponds that survive are at Hamarikyu Detached Palace, which you can also visit. However, the Yasuda Gardens pond is equipped with pumps which mimic the movement of the tide, uncovering the stone steps on a daily basis. I swapped seasons there. This is May with the azaleas blooming. In the bottom left, we have Okome-gura, or the shogunate rice stores. And on one of the rice storage wharves is the Shubino-matsu pine, or the pine of success. And on the far bank is another way marker, which is an oak tree, Shinoki. The pine bows down, almost touching the waves. A covered boat meanders along the river, and a chokibune boat, a high-speed taxi, speeds past behind it. The pine survives today, albeit in its 7th generation form. Kano Kyue beautifully depicts a full view of the rice warehouses and the pine about 50 years before Hokusai's painting. And Hiroshige depicts the pine also covered with a covered boat underneath. This painting hints at a tryst. We see 2 pairs of shoes outside the roofed area with the blinds drawn. And can you see the silhouette of a woman behind the screen? Very clever device that Hiroshige uses. A poem from the 1760s states, "Within sight on the left and right banks, the oak tree soars above the roofs, while the pine tree flourishes amongst the waves." It hints how men would wistfully look back towards the Yoshiwara after a night of success. It is the pine of success when they were heading back home in the dawn. Perhaps if you were heading up the river, it hints at the sense of excitement as you pass this waypoint on the way to the Yoshiwara. The location of the old rice store is memorialized with a carved stone marker. And painting a year later, Hokusai, in another work, more clearly depicts the oak tree on the far bank and the second of the bridges, the Ishihara Bridge. We next come to a red flag and the hototogisu, or the little cuckoo. The red flag is advertising for the makeup store Hyakusuke. Many customers would drop by here and purchase white or red makeup as a gift to their favorite courtesan. The hototogisu flies above the roof of the Komagata-do hall. Its cry is praised in Japanese poetry, perhaps because the word in Japanese, hototogisu, has 5 syllables which fall into the natural breathing group of the Japanese language and is a popular length of a line in poetry. Perhaps because its call, which you can hear, is forlorn, and in poetry is a metaphor referring to transience or elusiveness. In literature and myth, it is associated with the longing of the spirits of the dead to return to their loved ones. Here, it could suggest the sad departure of a male lover after a nocturnal tryst. It is a device used often in art, with the cuckoo plunging downwards, suggesting mourning, longing, and melancholy. Hokusai is credited with creating the device in the 1830s, but I believe our scroll is an even earlier example from 1805. 50 years later, Hiroshige copies the scene from Hokusai scroll exactly, with the Hyakusuke red flag and white walls of the Komagata-do hall and the plunging cuckoo above. Now, he also depicts timber felled in the Chichibu Mountains and floated downstream, and then stored vertically at the Komagata ferry terminal. And Hokusai also depicts this timber being floated downstream. The Hyakusuke cosmetic store was located diagonally across the road from Komagata-do Hall. On a corner, the Shimizu Inari Shrine on the opposite corner is now incorporated into the Komagata-do Hall. Which would have looked very much like this nearby store. Hyakusuke produced advertising leaflets. The flyer used the cuckoo device and spoke of the rich white and red makeups for sale. The white makeup was called oshiro. Disappointingly, the Komagata-do is no longer white. It's red today. It's an important temple in the foundation story of Sensoji Temple. The story goes that two brothers found a small gold statue of the Bodhisattva Shokanzeon, or the sacred Kannon, in their fishing net in 628 CE. A local wealthy landlord heard of the discovery and gave the brothers an impassioned talk about Buddhism. He built a thatched hut here to venerate the statue, and the brothers worshipped the statue for the rest of their days. The statue is now the hidden, revered deity of Sensoji Temple. And the landlord and the two brothers are deified and worshipped at the Asakusa Shrine in the grounds of Sensoji Temple. And we'll visit both of those in a moment. I took this photo from where Hyakusuke would have been located, on the opposite corner. Kano Kyue also depicts the white walls of Komagata-do Hall and the vertical green bamboo and brown timber stored vertically here. This is, about 50 years before a Hokusai scroll. The Kaminarimon Gate to Sensoji Temple, and its eastern pagoda and main hall of worship. The Okawa Bridge, built in 1774, as I mentioned, is called Azumabashi Bridge today. This wooden version was replaced in 1887 with a steel bridge. And this is the bridge today, leading towards the Sky Tree and the well-known Asahi beer headquarters, which was designed by Philip Stark to look like a frothy jug of beer. And note, for beer lovers, there is a beer hall in both buildings, worthy of a visit for sampling Asahi's best beers. Just past the location of the beer hall and offices are two bridges and the Kitajikkengawa River. Now, the smaller bridge was on the Mito estate of a powerful feudal lord whose family would provide the 15th and last shogun of the Edo period. The little bridge was called the Shinkoume Bridge, or the New Small Plum Bridge. The Mito feudal lord's estate in Ibaraki is still famous for its plum groves, indeed one of the three most famous gardens of Japan. Now, the two bridges were referred to by the locals as the pillow bridges because they looked like the pillows of a married couple, Shin-san and Gen-san. The Kitajikken River has now been redeveloped and vastly improved as part of the Sky Tree project. You can just see the legs of the Sky Tree, the white steel there on the right-hand side. Now, Galleon is a company that provides cruises along the old canals of downtown Edo. Most cruises are quite reasonable, about 3,000 yen, and they take about 2 hours. Now, this sort of expert course, is only offered occasionally, but it does take us along most of the important old canals, starting at Skytree there, up to the right along the Kita Jikken River, down the Yoko Jikken River, and then it weaves through Fukagawa, I've mentioned, the unlicensed Courtesan district of Old Edo, and then up the Sumida River, past the Ryogoku Bridge at number 15, the old rice stores at number 17, Komagata-do Hall at number 19, and then turns back at the Sanya Canal and concludes at Azuma Bridge. So this part of the tour emulates our water taxi ride to the Yoshiwara. Galleon may not offer this expert course all the time, but they offer shorter, wonderful segments of this course. The Pillow Bridge, or Makurabashi, was well known for the Yaomatsu restaurant at its corner. It is said in those days that Yaomatsu was a two-storied, stylish restaurant. The Makura Bridge added elegance to the scene. From the top floor of the restaurant, customers could enjoy views of the tall pagoda of Sensoji Temple to the left and the forest of Matsuchiyama Shoden to the right. Also in those days of clear skies and views, Mount Tsukuba could be seen from the rear of the building in the far distance. It was indeed a magnificent setting. Now, the Mito Tokugawa lower residence survives today and is called the Sumida Park. It's a fine strolling garden. This pond is no longer tidal. It was the lower residence of the Mito Tokugawa family. The family had an office close to the Edo castle and an upper estate close to the castle, and this more relaxed, spacious lower estate was where they would have had warehouses full of food for emergencies and a residence to withdraw to in the event of fire within the city. On the near bank is Sensoji Temple, the bottom left there. Sensoji is the oldest temple in Tokyo, dating, as you know, to 628 CE, when the two brothers discovered the gold statue of Kannon. And so it's one of the city's most significant temples. The temple's first pagodas were built in 942 by the great warrior Taira Kinmasa. These burnt down in the and were replaced in the 1640s, again by Tokugawa Iemitsu. Now, this is that 1640s pagoda. It's the east 5-story pagoda. The west one was 3 stories. It was repaired in 1886. And when they did the repairs, they collected donations by allowing people to climb the scaffolding. It survived until 1945, when it was burnt down in that 10th of February 1945 bombing raid I mentioned earlier. The main hall contains the hidden object of devotion, the small statue of the Bodhisattva Kannon, goddess of mercy, and this was rebuilt in 1958. And the 5-story pagoda was rebuilt in 1973, but it was rebuilt on the west side where the 3-story pagoda was located, and where the 5-story was located on the right side, there is no pagoda standing today. Now, note the position of the Asakusa Shrine within the grounds of Sensoji. This is a Shinto shrine, hinting at the syncretic nature of Shinto and Buddhism in Japan. Now, you will recall that the shrine is dedicated to the 2 brothers and the wealthy landowner who first worshipped the Bodhisattva Kannon at Komagata-do Hall on the banks of the Sumida River. So this structure here is very important. It was built in 1649 by the 3rd shogun, Iemitsu, but it did not burn down in World War II, miraculously saved. It is one of Tokyo's important structures from the Edo period. It is in the Gongen style, an architectural style used when humans are deified within the shrine. Again, I suggest you visit at 6:30 a.m. just as the priests are opening the doors to this very important structure. You'll be alone to contemplate this history. If you are a late riser, then the bustle of the main shopping precinct in front of the temple is a lot of fun. This shopping district starts at the Kaminarimon gate, depicted with this small gate by Hokusai. This is the spectacular gate today. The shops here were granted to locals in the 18th century. There are 89 stores today in the street, all with very interesting histories. One, for example, is said to be the birthplace of the waving lucky cat that we see in a lot of restaurants, beckoning customers and good fortune. And in the spring, you might consider visiting the gardens of Denboin, which is the residence of the head priest. They're often missed by busy tourists stuck in the shopping street. Continuing along upstream, we come to the Mimeguri Inari Shrine. The shrine was prayed to for drought busting and good harvests, but came into prominence because of the patronage by Edo's most famous merchant family, the Mitsuis. The Mitsuis founded Echigoya, which would later transform into today's Mitsukoshi department store and the Mitsui Corporation. Now, the Mitsuis favored the shrine simply because the characters for their family name were so similar to the characters for the Mimeguri shrine. This is Mitsui, except that the shrine name has this protective square around the second character, and this delighted the Mitsuis. They thought the shrine was protecting their name. The family donated the current structure, which was built in 1862. It is an Inari shrine, the god which protects crops and harvests and good fortune in business. The messenger of the Inari deity is the fox, which stands as guardian out front. This is the temple's stamp, confirming that I had visited and donated to the temple. That's important. And on the old map of Edo on the left, you can see that indeed the shrine used to be located in the middle of rice fields. The locals found the torii gate of the Mimeguri shrine enchanting because it was half obscured by the embankment of the Sumida River, as it is today. This stone torii gate was also donated by the Mitsui family and is a treasured cultural asset of the Sumida ward. Hiroshige also delighted in the unusual view of this torii gate. The restaurant he depicts was designed to enjoy the cherry trees along the Sumida, and these are still famous today. Now, a number of unusual objects have been donated to the shrine more recently by the Mitsui family. As I mentioned, the Mitsuis established the famous Echigoya department store in the Edo period, which is now Mitsukoshi department store. And when they closed their Ikebukuro Mitsukoshi department store, they donated to the shrine this famous lion, which stood outside the store. The lion is modeled on the Trafalgar Square lion. But in times of coronavirus, it seems he is the guardian of hand sanitizer tied around his neck there. And the Mitsuis donated this unusual three-sided torii gate, which was originally located in the Mitsui family home in central Tokyo. Now, this whole house has been relocated to the wonderful Edo Tokyo Open Air Architectural Museum, and I can highly recommend. This is a wonderful visit. The home is an interesting blend of Western and Japanese styles. And one final look at Hokusai's wonderful detail of the Mimeguri shrine. Next, Hokusai depicts a grouping of 2 temples and a shrine. An old Edo map indeed indicates that these 3 were grouped together. However, they have since been spread out along the banks of the Sumida River. Ushijima Shrine is actually next to the grounds of the old Mito domain residence, the Sumida Park, which you've already visited. So when you depart the park, please make sure you drop by the Ushijima Shrine. Now, this shrine is famous for its nade ushi, or stroking cow. These are common in other shrines. You stroke the part of the body of the cow which is ailing you, its knees or its stomach. However, this cow is unusual in that it's believed that it will cure mental health issues and affairs of the heart if you've got a broken heart. So you can see that it's got a place there that's very well rubbed on top of its head. Further north is Chomeiji Temple, which is worth dropping by for its sakura mochi rice cakes wrapped in a pickled cherry leaf, again famous from the area. The food has a history of 300 years from the early Edo period. And Kofukuji worships the deities of coughs, perhaps a good one to pray to in recent times. And then on the near side of the Sumida River, we visit the Matsuchiyama Shoden Temple. Now, the foundation myth of this temple states that during the reign of Empress Suiko, who existed in the 6th, early 7th century, a hill suddenly appeared. So perhaps with some seismic movement, there was a hill appeared from the depths of the earth. And then 6 years later, a drought affected the area. And the myth goes that an 11-faced Kannon, the goddess of mercy, appeared on this hill, but taking the form of Kangiten or Ganesha to save the locals. I really love Kangiten in Japan. Now, Kangiten in Japan grants wishes, but it is still bound by base desires. So it's a volatile god. Unlike in Hindu, Kangiten is not normally visible. So he's a hidden deity. And he sometimes appears like Ganesha with the elephant head, a single male deity with the elephant head. But in Japan, he's more commonly portrayed as a male-female coupling. This is the old Imado-bashi Bridge with the hill behind it and the temple on top. And today you'll climb the same hill and pay your respects at the shrine dedicated to Kangiten, Ganesha. And because Ganesha loves daikon radish, or he does in Japan, you might consider purchasing a daikon radish to present to him. And after it's been offered to him, nothing is wasted, and so you can you're welcome to take some radish home with you. The little Sui Jinja shrine is nestled in a wood, which Hiroshige also beautifully depicted, and his woodblock print was titled Wood of the Water God. And the shrine is favored by local boat owners for safety on the water, and is very famous for starting the annual July Sumida River Fireworks Festival, which started in 1733 and is still held annually in July and is really spectacular. Mokuboji is an interesting visit, a temple. This temple was built in, well, it's a sad story. It was built to pray for the soul of Umewaka Maru, a young child, an aristocratic child who was kidnapped in Kyoto and trafficked as a slave, dragged all over Japan, and died here on the banks of the Sumida River. And a priest built a mound to commemorate his passing. Here we see the young Umewaka Maru being dragged along, and he perishes on the Sumida River. His mother is crazed with anguish and searches all over for him, finally crossing the Sumida River. Now, this is depicted in a very famous Noh play, which is very moving. She finds the mound built by the priest commemorating her child, and so she prays in front of it for the repose of the spirit of her child, and his spirit appears from behind the mound, which has a weeping willow planted on top. Now, this mound indeed survives today, and I can highly recommend the Noh play. Now, the video I'm going to show you is advertising material for the performance at the wonderful Kita Noh Theatre. And so it's highly stylized, but you'll get the idea. You'll get the feeling of the emotion of the mother who is praying, saying, Namu Amida Butsu, praise Amida Buddha, praise the Buddha of infinite light. And in her anguish, she collapses onto the mound. Now, remember, this is a man playing the anguish of this crazed mother. And can I just give one more plug for the wonderful Kita Noh Theatre and their permission for using this clip. An unmissable experience when you're in Tokyo. Now, Mount Tsukuba is visible in the clear skies of the Edo period, as we learnt from the Yaomatsu restaurant. It's one of the important mountains to the feng shui of Edo. The streets actually off the Ginza are aligned with this mountain. And even today, it's occasionally visible from Tokyo. The other mountain is, of course, Mount Fuji. The main streets of the center of Edo are perfectly aligned with Mount Fuji. Now, this street in Hiroshige's print is actually today's Mitsukoshi department store. This is the Echigoya, and this Surugacho street is the one that's perfectly aligned with Mount Fuji. We arrive at the Imadobashi Bridge, where we will alight from our high-speed ferry. The bridge across the Sanya Canal, which was artificially created to alleviate flooding higher up on the Sumida River. Today, a small monument marks where the Takeya ferry terminal was located. And from here, it's about a 15-minute walk up to the Yoshiwara along the embankment of the Sanya Canal. And Kano Kyue depicts this scene very beautifully. You can see all the little choki bune, the boar tusk boats. They're even parked, moored further up the Sanya Canal there as well. You'd get out either on this side or the other side of the bridge. You wouldn't make your way up the Sanya Canal in a boat. But Hiroshige's view is from the poorer side of the river. In the background, the other side of the river is bustling with lights ablaze, including the Imadobashi Bridge and the ferry terminal. And on the right, the popular Ariake-ro restaurant. So Hiroshige depicts this dour courtesan. She's dressed in very drab clothing, but he's thereby presenting the yin and yang of the river, comparing the different economic conditions of each side of the river. Kobayashi Kiyochika's print depicts the Ariake-ro restaurant with courtesans entertaining on the second floor. And this restaurant is the subject of many other prints. This by Ochiai Yoshiyuku with the courtesans, geisha serving sake to customers. Now, by 1975, the canal was completely filled in. So customers, as I mentioned, would catch ferries up to the bridge and they would visit both the Yoshiwara and the theatre district, which was right behind the ferry terminal. The theatre district was called Saruwaka-cho. Hiroshige depicted the Saruwaka-cho theatre district in this famous print. This is the one I mentioned with his use of shadows. But remember, this is 50 years after our scroll, but this print takes Edo by storm. And the shadows are central to the magical quality of this image. And art historians will tell you that shadows were a curiosity at this time, but you know that Hokusai was already 50 years before this was painting shadows. But the shadows do conjure up this otherworldly atmosphere. And having a bit of fun here. This is that street today, which is a shopping street, recreated as Hiroshige's print. Now, Saruwaka-cho had 3 main kabuki theatres. It was a gated precinct, but with 3 gates. The Yoshiwara had just 1 gate. And the 3 main theatres were the Nakamuraza, Ichimuraza, and Kawarazaki-za is not yet built in this the time of this painting. As I mentioned, they're all kabuki theatres. Now, I mentioned that Yoshiwara geisha were referred to as Yagura geisha because of the Yagura in front of the theatres here at Saruwaka-cho. You can just see them. They indicated that the theatre was licensed and a drum would be played from the Yagura scaffolding to attract business. Now, the photograph on the right is the Kabuki Theatre in the Ginza today, but the theatre only puts the Yagura out for its November performances. Now, there were 9 bridges along the Sanya Body Canal, the second being the Shoden-bashi Bridge. Now, today, these bridges are commemorated along a very pleasant green strolling avenue covering the old Sanya Canal. Now, the 800 meter stretch of the Sanya Canal embankment was called the Nihonzutsumi. It was lined with hundreds of tea houses, each associated with a particular Yoshiwara brothel, and the full bill would be paid here in the morning. The tea houses were known as amigasa chaya because they would, in the very early days, they'd rent a hat with which you could disguise yourself. But the name stuck even after the practice of renting a hat to cover one's identity entering the Yoshiwara faded out from the mid-Edo period, from the 18th century. Hiroshige depicts the Nihonzutsumi and the amigasa tea houses. And in the distance, he sets off the Yoshiwara as a separate world with a line of rose-tinged clouds. Now, formerly it's called the Shin Yoshiwara. The old Yoshiwara was near Ningyocho, near Nihonbashi, and this was the new Yoshiwara, but most people just refer to it as Yoshiwara. On a raised piece of land in the distance is a shogunate-owned housing estate for foot soldiers who bore muskets and bows and arrows. We then come to the Mikaeri Yanagi, the looking back willow tree. This is the tree today. The name comes from the practice of looking back, feeling painful reluctance to leave the pleasure quarter and perhaps a favorite courtesan. Now, the interpretation board doesn't translate these humorous Senryu poems, and so allow me to give it a go. I translate them literally, but the first one is Kinuginu no ushirogami hiku yanagi kana. Sleeping together with bed clothing intermingled, today my heart remains tangled. This weeping willow reminds me of my torment. Perhaps a little bit too literal. And the second one, Mikaereba ikenka yanagi kao o uchi. Leaving with deep regret, I turn back. Is it my broken heart or the willow tree that slaps me in the face? So you sort of get the idea. Now, the planting of this willow tree is a tradition that actually comes from Kyoto, the much older Shimabara pleasure quarter in old Kyoto, where a weeping willow also still stands at its main gate in Kyoto today. Now, the word for main gate in Kyoto dialect is omon, not daimon, as it would be read in Edo language. But Edo courtesans use the same kamigata or Kyoto refined language, and so Yoshiwara omon is the correct reading. Unlike the Yoshiwara, Shimabara was open to everyone, male and female customers alike, and the prostitutes were free to come and go, unlike the Yoshiwara. Customers would descend the emon slope, the dressing slope, where customers would adjust their clothing, making sure they were looking fine as they entered the Yoshiwara. The slope has a dogleg in it today. Three theories exist for this switchback. The first, simple physical requirements to get down the slope using a switchback. The second, the need to hide the faces of those entering the Yoshiwara, so you can't see people as they turn the corner. And the third is perhaps to hide the gate from the shogun when he was out hunting. There were two guardhouses outside the Omon gate, one to check customers coming in, which was the left-hand one, and the other, more important one, to stop prostitutes escaping. Now, at the end of the Edo period, all of these guardhouses around the city of Edo were replaced with koban, the famous koban of Tokyo, or these are police boxes. And indeed, this was the case at Yoshiwara. There's a police box standing where these guardhouses used to stand. Now, at the top of the embankment, there were over 10 horse meat restaurants. 3 remain, selling the so-called named or disguised cherry blossom meat. Now, wonderful Mr. Nakae's restaurant is one of these 3 famous restaurants that are still in business. And he sometimes conducts tours around the old Yoshiwara district. It's a bit safer if you're with him. It's quite safe to go up to this restaurant area along the embankment. Now, customers would have a hot pot of horse meat for breakfast in the morning after visiting the Yoshiwara. The food was called ketobashi, or to kick away, meaning to kick away the venereal disease, because horses were good at kicking. And then finally, we arrive at the Yoshiwara Omon Gate. Hiroshige depicts the fine gate, which held much anticipation for male customers. Remember, only males could visit, and was a symbol of imprisonment for the women. As fine and as doted upon as the senior oiran may have been. This beautiful oiran would have cost about $1,500, and with a meal and other arrangements of entertainment, music, the evening would have cost about $3,000 in today's money to hire an oiran. This is the Omon of 1881, 14 years after the end of the Edo period. Inscribed on the gate is a poem in Chinese penned by the author Fukuchi Ochi, and my translation is, "Truly tender is the dream of spring as cherry blossoms cloud the streets. Autumn's arrival is heralded by the shadows of lanterns lit on both sides of the street." Now, there were 4 main festivals in the Yoshiwara, as I mentioned: the Cherry Blossom Festival in spring, and this Lantern Festival, which was dedicated to the spirit of Tamagiku, a beautiful young prostitute who died in 1726 at the young age of 24. This is the beautiful Tamagiku. The third festival was sort of an amateur comedic play night, and the fourth festival was the parade of oiran that we've seen, that's reenacted today. Jippensha Ikku depicts the Lantern Festival, people hanging the lanterns in autumn in Tamagiku's memory. Now, this is the gate in 1897 with this strange arch installed. Now, the Shin Yoshiwara was as I mentioned, the only licensed courtesan district in Edo. Its history began in 1612 when Shoji Jinyemon, owner of a brothel, wrote to the shogunate imploring the establishment of a licensed district for brothels. The shogunate conditions for approval of the Yoshiwara in 1617 were that no brothels could operate outside the district, and prostitutes must not leave the district. Customers must not stay long-term in the brothels, so no longer than one night, and prostitutes must not wear provocative clothing, and the buildings in the Yoshiwara must not be garish. And customers without proper identification must be turned away by the shogunate police, who manned the left-hand guardhouse, and the owners of the tea houses manned the right-hand guardhouse because they were concerned about prostitutes escaping that they had paid for. Now, the Yoshiwara was completed in 1626 in the center of the city but it was destroyed in the 1657 Meireki Great Fire that I mentioned, and it moved here to the new or Shin Yoshiwara, although actually the order to move had been made before the Great Fire. Now, a few vestiges remain, including in the very top right-hand side there, one of the shrines which stood at the four corners where the prostitutes would pray. That survives. And parts of the moats which surrounded the Yoshiwara, which kept the girls imprisoned. Also nearby is a temple, which is known as the Temple for Courtesans Tossed Away. Prayers are still offered here for the repose of the countless prostitutes who are interred here. Hokusai then depicts the main street of the Yoshiwara called Nakano-cho, and the middle street, and the first side street, Edo-cho. He also depicts the fire tower, a lookout for fires. So we see the Edo-cho, Nakano-cho, and the fire tower. And this is what Nakano-cho looked like in the early Meiji period. Hokusai then brings us inside one of the tea houses or brothels. Two men are depicted in a reception room where food organized by the inviting tea house would be presented. This delicious sea bream, a symbol of good fortune, has been presented to them and then will be cooked shortly for them. Following the meal, entertainment is provided, perhaps some dance or music, singing. And as mentioned, this may be a self-portrait of Hokusai. And we conclude with this intimate scene inside the antechamber. At this point, I'd like to introduce a working tea house. The restaurant is called Genyadana Hamadaya. It is located back in Ningyo-cho, in the middle of the first Yoshiwara district, which is about a 30-minute walk from the conclusion of our suggested day walk at the Sumida Hokusai Museum, back across past Ekoin, over the Ryogoku Bridge to Genyadana Hamadaya. So there it is. That is the original Yoshiwara, which existed here between 1626 and 1657. And Ningyo-cho Station, the subway station, is right next to the restaurant. Now, Hamadaya flourished in the late 1800s. It was originally a brothel called Okiya. The most famous geisha of the time, Sadayako, hailed from Hamadaya and attracted many guests, including Japan's first prime minister, Ito Hirobumi. But in 1912, the brothel closed and the business continued as a restaurant. The meals, as is always the case, the meals are priced differently for lunch and dinner. So for about $200 for lunch and $400 for dinner. But it's a lot extra if you would like to have geisha accompany the experience. But even without the considerable expense of involving geisha, the restaurant's a fine way to experience the cuisine of the old Yoshiwara district. Hokusai depicts the interior of a brothel of 1811 in this large format Nishikie painting. This large format is unusual for Hokusai, who usually paints on single Orban papers. He depicts the owner and his wife at their all-important accounting station. The owner's getting a hand massage while his wife, who's really in control of the business, checks the accounts book. Just behind them is the Engi Dana, or good luck shelf, a little Shinto shrine with offerings of sake and the guardian dogs there and Daruma dolls. Courtesans are busying themselves getting ready for the evening, applying makeup and checking their kimono. Large barrels of sake are ready to be served to the guests. Lamps are ready to light the candles for the evening, and trays for serving the food are being wiped down, and the kitchen fires are being lit. So thank you for joining me on this journey.